So, we'd like to welcome both of you, Katie and Stephania, to our Developing Self Conference 2021. And we are also interested to hear about your project. But before we start that, maybe both of you could just introduce yourself a little bit so we can contextualize where you are and what your work is. That would be great.
Nice. So I am Katie Fittipaldi, and I am Zooming from Rochester, New York. And I teach Alexander Technique at the Eastman School of Music and the Eastman Community School. And I'm also a cellist, and I have a wonderful studio of about 15 students.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. My name is Stephania Romaniuk, and I'm joining you from Calgary, Canada, which also happens to be gloomy, channeling London weather. So my background is as a vocalist. I completed my Bachelor of Music in Vocal Performance from the Eastman School of Music, and several years later, I came back to do a graduate degree in music education, which is where I got involved in research and how I'm involved in this particular project.
So I wonder if, Katie, you'd be happy to sort of set us off with telling us about the project and how it came about and how it's been interconnected with this research study that you're doing together.
Absolutely. So way back in 2017, I attended the San Diego AGM for the American Society for the Alexander Technique, our big conference. And before I even went to the conference, I found out that an Alexander teacher named Stephen Parker was giving a talk. And the title of his talk had the word integrated teaching, the words integrated teaching and learning in it. And that really had me. So I went to the conference, I listened to Stephen's talk, and he told us all about this model that they've been implementing at the Norwegian Academy of Music and since then other institutions that Stephen's connected to. And so I talked to him afterwards, and he ended up coming to visit our school a few times to teach and to answer my hundreds and hundreds of questions about how the model was implemented. And we started to develop a plan to launch a project. We started to think about whether we wanted to just try it out or do a research study. And for a variety of reasons, we chose to do a research study, and I'm really glad we did. It's nice to have the data, and so it doesn't just disappear. And I learned so much about it. And thank goodness Stephania came on board in spring 2019, and she's been absolutely fabulous in terms of organization, and her knowledge about research is so incredibly helpful. So we ended up planning the project and then launching it in the fall of 2019. And it took place the whole academic year. So it concluded in April, May 2020. So we had a whole year to let it unfold, which was really exciting. And just to give you a sense of the timeline now, Stephania is continuing to code the data and collect and write up the research paper. So that's continuing, which is very exciting. Yes, and I can also give you an idea of the structure of the project, if that.
Yeah, fantastic. That would be really interesting. Thank you.
So this was modeled after the iterations at the Norwegian Academy. So in our study, there were 12 participants. There are 3 faculty members, And each faculty member had 3 students within their studio that participated in the project. And each participant received 10 Alexander private lessons, one-on-one lessons. And each studio met 6 times with the 3 students and the 1 faculty member plus me, the Alexander teacher, met 6 times for collaborative group sessions. So in these sessions, we would all be together and interacting and learning and interacting together. And there were also 3 large group meetings throughout the project, one at the beginning, one at the middle, and one at the end. And this was everyone. And those were mostly just for feedback, questions, just to see how everyone was doing and even share your experiences so far. So that was really helpful. And then there was a pre and post questionnaire that all the participants, including me, filled out. And then at the end, there was Stephania interviewed all the participants. So there was an interview at the end. They were also given a copy of this wonderful book called Alexander Technique for Musicians. So you may know of it. And so they had that as a resource as well. So that was the basic structure and what went on in the project.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, obviously, very much for using our book. That's the gratitude there, but also for explaining this extraordinary model of collaborative learning. It's just fascinating. So Stephania, it'd be really interesting to hear your role as the researcher and kind of a little bit about the purpose of the research and what kind of research it would sort of be understood as. That would be great.
Absolutely. So my role was as research assistant. So the principal investigator is Dr. Donna Brink Fox. And so she oversaw the project. And I sort of did the legwork of helping organize the large group meetings, and also to collect and to analyze the data. And so when we talk about data analysis for this type of project, it's slightly different from other projects. And I'll go into that just shortly. But in terms of the purpose of this particular study, I think what we settled early on is basically we wanted to look at what are the learner outcomes in this type of a learning situation where you do have this collaboration between the main instrument teacher and the Alexander Technique teacher, and also the main instrument teachers themselves receiving Alexander Technique instruction. How is that kind of an environment like structured? What is it? How is it characterized? How could one characterize the learning that takes place there, and also just sort of the dynamics that happen? There are a few other questions that we were interested in, like sort of what's the feasibility of doing this at a post-secondary? What are sort of some of the resources that you might have to have in place to make this work? What are the ways that students themselves are interested in pursuing this type of instruction following the project? So I would say that those were some of the focuses of this particular study, was getting just a better sense of what are the outcomes when you have this type of learning situation in place. In terms of the type of research, this is what would be called qualitative. So I'll give just a short summary of the difference between quantitative and qualitative research studies. So in terms of quantitative, this is a bit more of the traditional experimental design, where you're testing a hypothesis, you're determining specifically cause and effect between different variables that you isolate. And this is a type of study that might more commonly take place in a laboratory setting. So as an example, if we were looking at the influence of Alexander Technique instruction, we might compare, let's say we measure the heart rate of a performer, before, when they go into a performance, then they have some trial of Alexander Technique instruction, and then we measure their heart rate again and see, okay, is there some cause and effect measured through a really specific instrument that we can determine there's that sort of causal relationship between these variables. Now, qualitative studies, which is the type that we did, have a different process and a different purpose. They explore a concept or a phenomenon much more holistically, typically in natural settings, and they rely on data in the form of texts or images. So for instance, in our case, we had interviews, observation notes, questionnaires. You could also look at historical artifacts, journal entries, video footage, this type of thing. So in terms of data analysis, the researcher really is looking for emerging themes or patterns that come up through the participants, emphasizing the participants' own views. That's really important in this type of narrative work. And in fact, typically in the sort of the final report, you'll often find quotations from the participants themselves, because you're really spotlighting what their own experiences were through their own words. And so as such, these studies are different from quantitative studies in that the findings, they aren't generalizable. They're really meant to study this specific instance of what happened. But that said, there are findings that I think are relevant to other similar situations. So that's sort of the nature of this type of research, and sort of what we were looking for when we were doing this particular study.
Fascinating, and somehow lends itself much more to the sort of means whereby kind of approach that we have to thinking about our work as a study analysis. So that sounds really great, and I'm sure lots of people will want to look into that further. Coming back to Katie, I'm really interested about what you sort of noticed with this model of teaching and how you found it. That would be really interesting to hear. And what differences were you noticing about the reaction of the students, really?
Well, I feel like of the teachers that I know that teach in music schools and conservatories, like my role prior to the project was pretty typical, I think. So I would teach workshops. I would offer little bunches of private lessons throughout the year. I teach a credit course in the fall and the spring, one for graduate students and one for undergraduate students, and some other things, depending, maybe a studio teacher wants me to come in and teach a workshop. But it's pretty rare for me to have communication with the main instrument teacher. It does happen, but it's pretty rare. Unless the studio teacher's present while I'm giving a workshop, which is wonderful. It's so nice to have them there to observe and offer feedback and just support the work. I guess being able to work with the studio teacher, the student, in a variety of ways, not just individual lessons, but in the collaborative group sessions, was really different than what I was used to. But it was so wonderful to be more central in my role. I felt like it could be a lot more supportive, and it gave me insight into the environment and sort of like what the student was learning. I had many chances to have continued dialogue with the student and the studio teacher, which I'm not used to having. So it was really wonderful to have that centralized role. And not only that, but I generally don't have a lot of time with the students. So having a whole year to develop a relationship with participants and to continue dialogue and continue learning and experimenting was really different, but just so wonderful. So I guess another different thing was the time that I had to work with the studio teachers and to kind of get to know what vocabulary they use and kind of how they teach. And then they get to know the vocabulary I use and how I teach. And it's just more synchronous than I was ever used to, which was really, really helpful. And I actually remember one the faculty members that I worked with were incredibly engaged and curious and asking questions and just totally on board and supportive. So, giving us a chance to clarify and connect with each other was really, really helpful. I remember one faculty participant asking, like, the question, like, how do you convey to a student a balanced posture? How do you convey in a way that's not like causing them to stiffen or relax? And I remember feeling like, oh, that's music to my ears. Like, let's talk about that. And then another faculty member I remember just started to get really curious as the project went on about ways to take care of themselves during teaching. And in between lessons. And that was just so lovely to be able to support that for the teacher. So
just want to quickly, sorry, that reminds me of something that I heard one of the faculty members say that I think perfectly demonstrates that. There's this beautiful vignette of this one teacher who had remembered bringing a sort of, I think in their words, an esoteric question about tongue position. And Katie responded with a whole slew of resources to be able to support that question. And I think that was a new experience for this particular faculty member. So I think, as you say, Katie, that was reflected from the participants' perspective as well, that ability to support their own learning journeys too.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So sort of actually quite a lot of unexpected outcomes, sort of in a way more deepening of the understanding of the work for both the faculty member and the student. Fantastic. Could you tell us, did you sort of have a curriculum or a syllabus that you were following? Or, often Alexander lessons sort of not random exactly, but they're kind of addressing what someone brings when they come into the room. Were you being a little bit more sort of specific to a curriculum?
Yes, that's a great question. That was one of my hundreds of questions to Stephen Parker was, should I have a firm or sort of firm idea about themes for each lesson or not? And he encouraged me to have a theme for each of the 10 lessons, which I did, and I really appreciate, because I felt like in the context of a research study, it was really important that each lesson basically be the same theme, but maybe flexibility in how to connect with that. But I did leave the collaborative group sessions completely free for the most part, except we did do a little bit specifically on breathing, but it was really participant generated inquiry for those. But to give you an example of the themes for the lessons, I modeled it after my class actually. So the first lesson was getting comfortable with constructive rest, and I'm sure I threw in some other ideas there. But the environment is really busy, and it just feels like any opportunity for rest and space and time and quiet was a good thing.
Right.
And then I talked about awareness and inhibition, direction, the stress response and gaining, breathing, and the visual system. And that was like the first 7 lessons, I think. And then the last 3 were choose your adventure. So they could come in with whatever they wanted to, and that was fun too.
Very interesting. That sounds brilliant. And yes, just going back to you, Stephania, what were you sort of finding out of emerging themes and findings from the research? We'd be really interested.
Well, there were plenty. So I think the first one I wanted to touch on is the what I would sort of seems like just the benefits of Alexander technique instruction of its own accord. And so there are plenty that emerge, but the three that I sort of wanted to touch on are just heightened awareness of the body and mental processes during music making. And I mean that to be, practice, taking lessons, performance, more physical and mental ease in practicing and playing or singing, more calm in participants' daily lives as an antidote to that stressful academic environment, which Katie was speaking about. And I think all of those things seem to support the musical and artistic goals of the participants. Um, and truly, I think the teachers and students reported their belief in the value of Alexander technique instruction in helping them achieve those goals. And I have a few quotes that I want to sort of intersperse here. One faculty member said, Alexander technique builds an understanding of the physical and mental challenges we all have, with the goal being to find ways to eliminate or at least minimize any impediments that might prevent us from sharing our gifts. Mm. So I think one of the things that I got from that quote is the physical and mental challenges we all have, which really leads me to the second finding I wanted to bring up, is that this Oslo model, it seems to foster an inclusive community of learners, that where each person's journey is supported by the other people who are around them. And they're all working towards these similar goals, trying to, work through the physical and mental challenges that they all have. And so this community is marked by shared, as I mentioned, shared personal journeys, where I think what was really coming out of the participants' narratives is they could learn by watching others work on these similar goals, whether that's reducing unnecessary tension to increase freedom, expression, confidence, and performance, or however their artistic goals manifest, they could see that reflected in the other participants. And there's a really nice quote also about one student said that he had begun practicing with the mirror, and he would notice similar actions in himself that he had already commented on in others playing. And so he said, then all of a sudden, those kinds of comments that I was used to giving to other people, I would be giving to the person that I saw in the mirror, and then I would change those things.
Fantastic. What I love is it sort of subverts the model that classical music has sort of got a bit saddled with, it, that we're all under pressure all the time and we're a little bit competitive with each other, and that actually that the learning we could be buddies with each other, and we could actually bring a whole different mental, emotional mindset to the learning environment. Fascinating. Just one more question on this theme, really, Stephania, about researching. Do you have any tips for us? Because we any tips for researching in this way? What did you find, and what would you recommend in that way to us?
I think, well, the first one is, I would say, if someone is interested in taking this on as a research project, please feel free to contact me. I'd be very happy to sort of go and sort of, as Katie did with Stephen, on the research end of things, how this worked. As it was, my impression was a little bit more stringent in terms of confidentiality of participants. Since we were working under the institutional review board. So it complicates a few things. But the most important thing I would say is that it would be really helpful to have a participant researcher, which is someone who is not completely removed from the study, but themselves participates in the actual study activities. And I think that in the case of Alexander technique, that's particularly important because it's a really challenging thing to understand without doing it yourself. Even if you are listening to all of the participants, it's not quite the same as having a little bit of experience yourself. So that's probably my biggest tip, is to consider having someone who is a little bit more removed, but someone who is actually participating in the study themselves.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting idea, actually, so that it feels like everybody's on the same page, kind of thing. Yeah, and not witnessing it from afar, but Yeah, being involved. I love that. Thank you. Katie, any sort of further things to share with us, and sort of, like, are you really keen to carry on with this model, and what has it brought to your teaching actually?
Hmm. Well, I guess I can answer that question in like different ways. I had a sense that I would love this kind of mode of working, and that was confirmed as I went through the project. And I wouldn't, I would jump at the chance to do more of this kind of work because it was incredibly satisfying. And I would say, in a lot of ways, it felt ideal to me to be in this role of and have this open dialogue and communication with the faculty and students. I think one of the things that I loved about this model was the opportunity for shared learning, not just in the private lessons, but in the collaborative group sessions. So it was a really fun way of uh, playing around with like a learning environment. So, for instance, each collaborative group session was a little bit different. Um, and some of the collaborative group sessions started with like questions. Like one of the studios, like there's always like a lot of great questions that started the session. And then for another collaborative group session with a different studio, it often started with like a check-in and just like the teachers sharing observations about the positive changes she was noticing, and also giving a space for students to share their feedback, ask questions. And so having that flexibility and time together was really great. And I remember talking with Stephen because I asked him what a collaborative session would look like, and he said, "Well, it really can be anything." So he said sometimes he is the sort of information primary, like sort of active information giver, and sometimes the studio teacher was, and he would just sit back, and sometimes it was a combination, and sometimes it was the students that were leading things. So that really appeals to me, that there's this kind of playing field that is dynamic and changeable. So that was really lovely. And then the other thing I'll say that I loved about this model is if a student would come with a particular challenge to a lesson or a collaborative group session or both, I knew that I'd see them in lessons, I'd see them with their teacher in collaborative group, and then I'd see them again throughout the cycle. And that kind of loop of learning is fantastic. It really felt so satisfying and very supportive to their learning.
Yeah, more like an ongoing conversation than sort of filling an empty vessel with information. Fantastic. Yeah, last thing, I don't think I asked you at the beginning. So were they all singers, or were they instrumentalists? Which
We had both singers and
yeah,
instrumentalists. Yep.
okay, yeah, just checking in on that. Thank you.
And
Of
actually, is there one thing that is it possible to add one thing to what Katie
course.
mentioned? Well, first of all, in terms of recruiting these faculty members, having faculty who seem to be open to this type of learning, I think was really important. And I would say, in fact, not only just that they were open, they were particularly enthusiastic about team teaching, about having their students learn from multiple perspectives, and really they bought into the value of that. And so I think that was a really key foundational piece for making it work, because one of the things that I didn't see it in the findings was students who were sort of struggling with taking in multiple perspectives. because this was sort of, really some kind of cognitive dissonance. It wasn't. All of these students, they themselves were open-minded and eager to learn from multiple perspectives, and themselves saw the value of hearing perhaps performance, instrument, or voice related information from their teacher, supported by Alexander Technique informed constructive comments from Katie. And it just seemed that the dynamic worked in that way, that students weren't left confused. And in fact, they just felt supported from these different perspectives. So I would say that in terms of finding those starting faculty members, having that open-mindedness also in the part of the students would be really key. At least it seems to work in our particular case.
Very, very interesting. And that worry that people have, that you have to sort of be very consistent and keep saying the same thing over and over, is actually dispelled with this. Very interesting. And actually hearing another voice saying a similar thing but slightly differently is really valuable.
Yes.
Well, I love that. So no gurus.
Yeah, and that's, in some of the other reports, I think and I might say this name wrong, but the Pranevicius Sempi report that came out about what was happening with those 3 iterations that Stephen Parker was working on. I think this was sort of a myth that this particular researcher wanted to sort of dispel, that in fact, and I'd say that in that particular report, the argument was made that the height of musical instruction is this integration. And I think Stephen Parker himself said the true value of this work is in integrating it. And so I would say that in our case, it amplified what was already going on. And because the teachers and the students were receptive and it was fertile ground, it seemed like there was this mutual support in terms of really complementing what was already happening and taking the instruction to the next level.
Fantastic. So sort of finding an educational model of safety rather than fear or competitive energy. Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much. I mean, it's just the most fascinating thing to hear about. And really, we look forward to the findings and hearing more about it and hoping that you can perhaps do it again, because it sounds like such a valuable thing. Sometimes it's good to do things twice, isn't it? get even more out of it. Thank you both so much. That was really interesting and very, very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.